Section 2. The Truth About Climate Change. Chapter 3. A Fuller Story on Climate Change. There is a meta-narrative about climate change, an overarching storyline that threads through almost everything we read and hear. The headlines of press releases from climate-concerned activists, the anxious sound bites of politicians, the TV news bulletins that pulse with urgency, the movies and books that sketch a bleak future. The narrative is this: global warming makes things worse, and since it touches almost everything, it makes almost everything worse. The storyline tells us that where there is more rain, the results will be floods, and where there is less rain, the result will be drought. Global warming will be good for bad things and bad for good things. This is a cartoon vision of the world. In real life, most things have both good and bad consequences. You get a new job with a higher salary, which is great, but then the stress causes you to sleep less and eat more unhealthy food. Losing your job feels devastating, but it might also lead you to reevaluate your life and choose a career that you enjoy more. Like most other things, global warming has both downsides and upsides. More rain can indeed lead to more flooding in some places, but more rain can also alleviate an existing drought. Overall, when we look at the scientific evidence, while an increase in rain often does alleviate droughts, it generally doesn't lead to more flooding, probably because humans use much of the additional water in agriculture and industry. None of this means that climate change won't in total have significant negative effects. None of it means that we shouldn't be concerned, but a one-sided representation means we're not being well informed. We need to see the bigger picture. According to the conventional narrative about climate change, unless we make dramatic alterations today, animals and people will die in huge numbers, the planet will become unrecognizable, and society will disintegrate. While horrifying, this story is comforting in its simplicity. It is also wrong, mostly because it is a cartoon setup. In this chapter, I will examine just a small handful of the stories that circulate widely about climate change in order to show how the failure to describe and communicate the full picture makes us badly informed and leads to poor policies. One of the iconic images of the coming climate apocalypse is the starving polar bear sitting mournfully atop a melting ice floe. Polar bears are adorable, and no one wants them to die. And what better symbol of global warming than endangered polar bears? In his 2006 hit climate change documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore showed a sad, animated polar bear floating away on a melting ice floe, presumably to its death. A campaign by environmentalists successfully convinced the U.S. government to declare the polar bear endangered in 2008. However, on a global level, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which decides what animals and plants are endangered, was only willing to call the bear vulnerable. This has been the outcome of every evaluation except one since 1982. The prediction that the polar bear would suffer immensely because of a lack of summer ice was always somewhat odd. Polar bears survived through the last interglacial period 130,000 to 115,000 years ago, when it was significantly warmer than it is now. They also survived the first thousands of years of the current interglacial period, when Arctic sea ice cover was strongly reduced, and there were even long periods of ice-free summers in the central Arctic Ocean. When polar bear specialist group conservationists began studying the polar bear population in the 1960s, they clearly found that the biggest threat was indiscriminate hunting. At that time, it was thought that the global population of polar bears was around 5,000 to 19,000. Hunting was regulated, and by 1981, the official estimate had increased to almost 23,000. Since then, their numbers have been growing overall. The group's latest official estimate comes from 2019 and is the biggest yet, at 26,500. Estimated number of polar bears from the main international body collecting polar bear statistics, the Polar Bear Research Group. Clearly, this is a conservation success that we should celebrate. Yet, given that the polar bear has been used for so long as an icon of climate change doom, this finding is actually quite embarrassing for campaigners. The result? Polar bears have been quietly dropped from the climate change narrative. The Guardian, a British newspaper that sees its mission as responding to the climate crisis, decided in 2019 that it would no longer illustrate as many climate stories with polar bears. The newspaper went on to announce that it would use more pictures of people in distress in extreme weather events, another problematic choice, as we will see in Chapter 4. Similarly, the federal government's Arctic Report Card heavily chronicled the decline of polar bears in its 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2014 reports. But now, with official estimates showing that their population is not declining, polar bears no longer get a mention. Nor did Al Gore's follow-up 2017 film, An Inconvenient Sequel, find room to share the good news about the bears' survival. The real threat to polar bears isn't climate change, it's people. Every year around the Arctic, hunters kill almost 900 of them. That's more than 3 polar bears out of every 100 that exist every year. If we want to protect them, rather than dramatically reducing carbon emissions to try to tweak temperatures over many decades with a clearly uncertain impact on polar bear populations, our first step should be to stop shooting them. In fact, when it comes to species extinction of both fauna and flora, human behavior is a much larger factor than climate change. The World Wildlife Fund Living Planet report, published in 2018, finds that exploitation, e.g. overfishing, and habitat loss, converting nature into farms and cities, are responsible for about 70 to 80% of all threats to species. When we look at what influences species extinction, climate change is one of the smallest factors, 5 to 12%. A 2016 study published in Nature similarly suggests that overexploitation, agriculture, and urban development are the most prevalent threats to species, with climate change the least important of 7 factors. This means that prosaic actions would be most helpful, things like regulating fisheries and ensuring more space for nature. So yes, if we want to save our plants and animals, we need to change our behavior, but not in the ways that climate activists will tell you. Aside from a polar bear, what's a better symbol of global warming than a heat wave? In recent summers, heat waves in Europe and parts of the United States have become the ultimate evidence that our planet is headed toward an unlivable future. There is nothing good about heat waves. They are dangerous and kill people. But in fact, cold weather is far more dangerous and kills more of the population. This means that as the world gets warmer, many people will actually benefit. Scientists who undertook the biggest ever study of heat and cold deaths, published in Lancet in 2015, examined 74 million total deaths from all causes in 384 locations in 13 countries. These included cold countries like Canada, temperate countries like Spain and South Korea, and subtropical and tropical nations like Brazil, Taiwan, and Thailand. The scientists found that heat caused almost 0.5% of all deaths, but more than 7% of all deaths were caused by cold. For every heat death, 17 people die from the cold. Deaths caused by the cold get less attention, partly because they are less sudden. Heat kills when body temperature gets too high, and this alters the fluid and electrolytic balance in weaker, often older people. Cold usually kills because the body restricts blood flow to the skin, increasing blood pressure and lowering our defenses against infections. Essentially, heat kills within a few days, whereas cold kills over weeks. In just the 13 countries examined in the massive Lancet study, 140,000 people died from the heat each year, and more than 2 million from the cold. We hear about heat waves that in a few days cause hundreds of deaths, but we do not hear about the thousands of slower, cold deaths. This is because there are no TV cameras when mostly elderly, weak individuals expire over weeks or months in anonymous apartments. Let's take as one example the United Kingdom. Each year, the UK experiences 33 cold deaths for every heat death. In one recent winter in England and Wales, the cold killed 43,000 people. In 1 year, in a single week in January, 7,200 people were killed who wouldn't otherwise have died. Because of the cold, the mortuaries were overflowing, and families had to wait for months to bury their relative. Yet this didn't become a widely known story because these cold deaths didn't fit the broader climate change narrative. It is similarly true for India. Recently, CNN capped a month-long report on the frightening impact of heat in India with the headline, "Dozens Dead in One of India's Longest Heat Waves." It was a powerful story told by media and climate campaigners around the world, but it was also rather curious because it focused on the smallest risk from temperature-related deaths. In fact, the scientific literature showed that while extreme heat kills 25,000 people each year in India, extreme cold kills twice as many. Indeed, the biggest killer is moderate cold, which kills an astounding 580,000 each year. CNN could have written plenty of stories telling us normal cold temperatures in India kill more than 500,000 people, but it never did. In Chapter 1, we saw that alarming headlines about thousands of future heat deaths are based on a study using the far-fetched assumption that nobody will buy air conditioning as temperatures rise. The latest US data on heat and cold deaths, which unfortunately covers up only to 2006, shows that heat deaths are few and are in fact declining because, in spite of the research assumption, people do buy air conditioning, whereas cold deaths are far larger and are actually increasing. Percentage of deaths caused by cold and heat in the United States, 1985 to 2006. Dashed lines show the best linear estimates. Why? It turns out that reducing death from heat is easier than reducing death from cold, in part because heat is a short-term phenomenon. You need an air conditioner just for a heat wave, and maybe you sit in the room where it's working for the worst days, whereas the cold requires long-term structural responses, such as insulating your home and workplace and continuous heating throughout the winter months. If we assume there is no adaptation, it is true that rising temperatures mean heat deaths will increase. But surely we should also recognize that higher temperatures mean fewer people will die from cold. And since cold deaths outweigh heat deaths almost everywhere, it turns out that even without adaptation, moderate temperature increases will likely mean that the people who didn't die of cold will roughly outweigh the additional deaths from heat. But crucially, it is implausible to disregard adaptation. As temperatures and wealth increase, people will correspondingly make changes to cope. Since it is much easier to adapt to heat than to cold, it is likely that the big killer will remain cold. We don't have global analyses for adaptation to cold and heat deaths, but for the United States, one 2017 study shows that with adaptation, even a significant temperature increase will lead to fewer deaths overall. There are two lessons we need to take away. First, hearing only about deaths caused by heat means we end up believing things are much worse, leading to more fear. Second, it means we focus on the smaller problem of heat deaths that in many places is relatively easily solved by simple adaptation measures already being undertaken. Instead, we focus too little on the bigger and often stubborn problem of cold deaths. A 2015 analysis of heat and cold deaths in Madrid showed that not only are cold deaths outweighing heat deaths 5-1, but also heat deaths are declining, especially in the older age groups. However, cold deaths are increasing for all groups. The researchers concluded that there is an urgent need to implement public health prevention and action measures targeted at cold waves, even in hot Madrid. What is climate change doing to nature? Based on what we hear every day, it's turning green pastures and forests into dust bowls. The reality is the opposite. Global warming is causing an unprecedented greening of the world, which scientists have been slow to recognize. But global greening has now been thoroughly corroborated in a number of global studies. The biggest satellite study to date, published in 2016, confirmed that over the past 3 decades, upwards of half the world's vegetated area is getting greener, whereas only 4% is browning. The overwhelming cause of global greening is carbon dioxide fertilization. That's right, carbon dioxide, which causes global warming, also helps plants grow, and more carbon dioxide makes them grow more. Reforestation and more intensive agricultural practices also contribute to the greening of the earth. China has seen its green area almost double in the last 17 years, partly because of a massive reforestation program, partly because of carbon dioxide, and partly because it grows multiple crops, keeping land green for more of the year. Researchers find that global greening over the last 35 years has increased leaves on plants and trees equivalent in area to 2 times the continental United States. It is equivalent to greening the entire continent of Australia with plants or trees 2 times over. It is quite remarkable that over a few decades we got the equivalent of 2 entire new continents of green because of carbon dioxide, and virtually nobody has heard about it. As we emit more carbon dioxide over the century, the world will keep getting greener, although there is still a significant debate over how much greener. If we measure the weight of all the vegetation in the world, one standard estimate shows that at the turn of the last century, we had about 530 billion tons on average over a year. Weight of vegetation in the world from 1850 to 2100. The black line is an estimate of the actual weight of vegetation, while the dashed line shows what will likely happen if we emit a lot more CO2 over the century. Estimate for the weight of vegetation in 1500 for reference. The mass of greenery declined slightly over the next 70 years as people cut down more forest and partly replaced it with farmland containing less green mass. But something amazing started happening in the 1970s, mostly because of global warming. We started getting more green vegetation, and this will continue over the century as we continue to emit more fertilizing carbon dioxide. Indeed, if we follow a standard worst-case scenario for carbon dioxide emissions to the end of the century, we could end up with almost 50% more green mass in the world by 2100. By one estimate, we would be above the amount of green the world had in 1500 before we started the widespread reduction in global vegetation. None of this is to suggest that all is well with global warming. Far from it. First, it is possible that not all the vegetation is the type we like or need, although it seems reasonable to say that in general we would prefer a greener world to a browner one. It also doesn't diminish the fact that many other challenges of global warming remain, including higher sea levels and more heat waves. But it is remarkable how little attention massive global greening has received. It's another way that the global warming discourse is too narrow in scope, focused just on the negative. The specter of more wars is another rallying point of climate change activists. They argue that climate change is a key cause of the ongoing civil war in Syria, and that this war is a harbinger of things to come. Warmer temperatures will mean more fighting. The reality is more complicated. In fact, the only robust scientific finding is that warmer temperatures are linked to less fighting. The idea that the atrocities committed in Syria can be blamed on global warming causing a drought is surprising, given Syria's history of bad water management, a population that tripled in 35 years and added pressure on resources, the effects of decades of American and British foreign policy in the region, Arab Spring uprisings, religious and ethnic tensions, political repression, and the interference of geopolitical powers. Moreover, recent drought also affected neighboring countries, including Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, yet civil conflict has not occurred on any similar scale there. A 2014 study of the role of drought and climate change in the Syrian uprisings concluded that, An exaggerated focus on climate change shifts the burden of responsibility for the devastation of Syria's natural resources away from the successive Syrian governments since the 1950s and allows the Assad regime to blame external factors for its own failures. A 2019 study similarly concludes there is very little merit to the Syria climate conflict thesis. Senator Bernie Sanders was knocked by PolitiFact's truth checkers for making this very argument when he was campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2015. Yet the narrative persists. Moreover, people make a significant but common logical mistake when they pinpoint a specific place like Syria, where global warming could potentially have made the drought worse. In the next chapter, we will see that globally, climate has worsened drought in some areas, but reduced it in just as many others. It follows that you cannot make the claim about global warming increasing drought in Syria and then ignore all the other places where it has decreased drought. It's true that over time, climate change will likely increase dryness in Syria, but as global warming also increases global precipitation, it will also make many other countries less water-stressed, including fragile nations like Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mali, and Burkina Faso. So if we worry that wars will be worsened in places like Syria, shouldn't we also be thankful that a reduction in future drought from global warming will make civil war less likely elsewhere? On a global scale, the latest survey, published in 2019, shows that the literature has not detected a robust and general effect linking climate to conflict onset. In fact, studies looking at temperature changes and the onset of wars in the Northern Hemisphere over hundreds or thousands of years show a clear correlation between colder temperatures and more war. The reason why cold is a cause of war is that it reduces agricultural production. This leads to social problems, which more often result in war, famine, and population decline. More importantly, we should be very careful in assigning blame for war to any aspect of the climate. In a recent 2019 study, researchers examined 16 different factors that drive the risk of conflict. When the scientists ranked that list in terms of influence, climate came in 14th, behind far more important factors like poor development, population pressure, and corruption. The scientists concluded other drivers, such as low socioeconomic development and low capabilities of the state, are judged to be substantially more influential, and the mechanisms of climate conflict linkages remain a key uncertainty. The narrative that higher temperatures equal more wars is not only facile, but ignores the research. The fact is that the only well-documented connection is the exact opposite. Over the past 1,000 years, more cold meant more conflict. We hear an unrelenting barrage of messages about climate change, and almost all of them are uniformly negative. If that's all we hear, then our understanding of the world is skewed. Just to be clear, global warming will in total have a negative impact on our planet and well-being, so overall there will be more bad than good impacts to describe. But the overarching narrative that insists on telling us only the bad stories is unlikely to give us adequate information with which to act smartly. It is important to get the whole picture.